the density of information was remarkable, and really, really rich and diverse set of opinions. When Chris Goranson and I were putting this together, I think we had hoped for exactly this kind of range of takes on exactly what security would be. I want to start with a term that can link across, I think, all of the presentations, which is perimeter. What it means to be able to define a perimeter. In the very end of Benjamin Bratton's presentation, he talked about the Japanese internment camps. During his presentation, he mentioned at one point that there was no outside to escape to, or perhaps there was only an outside. And then riffing on Pynchon and Deleuze, he said that the individual is now a digital sample, part of a predictive model. And of course, we imagine that there's a kind of dehumanization in the process that instantiates the human, the individual, the agent, seen only through those predictive models. And the question of what the state can see or what the state can sense seems to me to be a question which is equivalent to what the system can see or sense, or what the system can perceive and control. So in David's presentation, the question of the erosion of the perimeter is this key technical question. In Benjamin Bratton's presentation, it becomes a instrumentalized political and technological question. In Giorgia's presentation, in Dean's presentation, it becomes a question of perception and analysis of what the system is doing, the tools that allow you to perceive that, which of course relate back to what Benjamin's talking about, Benjamin Bratton, in terms of the ethics of the system, which in turn relate to an issue that Mako brought up, precisely that there's a question of motivation of the agent in the system. And so the question of how aware each of us as agents are that we have agency, how our agency is actually impinged upon by the system, and we can try to define what we mean by the system, and what kind of control we have in relationship to that, seem to me to be the questions that are at stake. This came up in the first panel as well. What can be seen, how we can develop a kind of a position of agency in relationship to it. I tried to use the terminology of mission in the first panel. And I think that the question I'd like to offer after framing things that way to the panel right now is, how can we decide whether we're on the outside of the system or the inside of the system? I mean, actually this passed by a couple of times during the discussions that indeed it's a philosophical question as much as it's a technical and political question. But let's leave that hovering in the background and just say right now, it's a technical question, a technological question, a political question. How can we actually choose which side of that perimeter we're standing on? And I don't mean to say, you know, in the Big Lebowski sense, you know, draw a line in the sand and across that line you do not step. I mean perimeter in the sense of how do we choose ourselves to be aware of what that limit of the perimeter is. And again, I think Ben Bratton, you were bringing this up when you started mentioning that the problem of the state and governmentality in general is precisely what the state can see. The modalities of the state, as you said, are determined by what the state can see or choose to see or sense, and that in turn determines what can be governed. But it seems to me that the question of being governed is also related to the question of ourselves perceiving the perimeter and choosing to act in relationship to that perimeter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks, Ed. You know, I'm to be real specific. The idea of this idea of seeing like a state, and that what it is that states can see. And for states, we could let's just say governmentality in the general sense of it, right? So I mean, corporations have governmentality. I mean, other things have religions have governmentality. It doesn't have to be just states. But to the extent to which these mechanisms are able to that their history is also a history of changing mechanisms of what it is that they're technically able to see, and that's what I think what Foucault's work has been very good at. In census taking, from surveillance cameras, from drawing lines, segmenting territory into time zones and zip codes and things like this. This being able to surveil is what they've done. And my suggestion is in this shift towards the epidermal is not that somehow this goes away or this is subsumed or sort of something like that, but there's another layer added to this, and this is this sensation, and the things sensing each other. I don't know that there really is an outside, to go to the other point. You raised a number of things. I suppose I agree enough with the basic premise of Sloterdijk's work to suggest that our organs have skin, our outer layers have skin, our clothing is skin, our buildings are a kind of skin, and ultimately the atmosphere that allows us to breathe is a kind of skin. I mean, we're all astronauts in a way, right? We cannot survive without these mechanisms that would allow us to survive. Even when we walk outside, right? We're still on the, we've evolved as a species that requires lots of layers of skin, both skins inside of us and skins outside of us to survive. Okay. So what I'm interested in, really, in a way, is both with the deep addressability, is not about, okay, here's another mechanism by which some mode of governmentality can name and track things and move them around so that we can have absolute supply chain visibility like the planetary skin sort of view. To me, that's kind of the least interesting part of it. To me, the interesting part of it is that something that exists at one scale, like, literally like Eames power of 10 scales, could actually exchange information with something that exists at a completely different scale. I mean, real Shannon information between each other, and that the always present condition of the world communicating itself could happen in ways that are sort of inconceivably, they're inconceivable to us, right? What it is that insects and flowers and dirt want to say, how they could communicate each other in a different sort of way is enormously interesting to me. And to me, that's the same question as this question of the designability of skin. It doesn't have to do so much with, in this epidermal question, it has to do with this, the capacity for something, for the one thing to sense information as it's coming from something else. Right? So I mean, the work of Joseph Wang in this lab, it's about explosions, and we're working with the technologies that we have. But it doesn't have to be. It could be a skin that senses anything, and it's our skin. It's all the skin around us, and skin pigment in this sort of structure as well. So for me, this question is this communicability with this as well. So I take a little bit of issue with the idea that it's only about the utilitarian, the utilitarian sort of thing with this as well. But I had something else I want to say about big data, but maybe we...
Well, Dean, Dean, you're essentially designing and working with a mechanism that can be part of that sensing network that Ben Bratton's talking about. So in a way, what you're doing is you're looking at a kind of a thermal howl of information, to borrow a term from Michel Serres, and you're actually filtering it down to something that's digestible and manageable. And as you said, you're throwing out petabytes upon petabytes of data to just store a particular set of selected information, if I understood correctly, which becomes this kind of corpus that you can then do deep analysis on. So it seems like the instrument that you're working with is one of the kinds of typologies of instrument, and similarly what Mako's doing in doing this sort of data analysis of the Scratch user base. They're working with instruments that allow us to actually understand what kinds of new forms of communication take place. And in your case, you're looking at threat reduction, but the way that Ben Bratton just described it, we could almost say that what you're doing is you're tracking a kind of an emergent sense.
Right.
It's an autonomous ecosystem in a way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of takes a branch off from the whole discussion about perimeter and state, the view the state has to the perimeter, which side they consider the perimeter. But yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work around medical ontology because what we're tracking are life forms. We treat them very much like life forms. The same way a virus or sorry about that. Sorry. The same way a virus or a bacteria invades your system and spreads throughout your system. The same way it infects, blood cells. It attacks other cells in your body. We use those same techniques and approaches to analysis and classifications, we focus more on, I guess, prototype-based ontologies, looking for relationships and artifacts. But it's very similar to what was discussed earlier about, in Giorgia's presentation about looking at, Foursquare and your social media, right? You're forming, ecosystems with technology, and by looking at those ecosystems from a biological perspective, you can make a lot of determinations as to what's going to occur, what's going to go forward with those systems. Going back to the earlier discussion about the perimeter, and what side of the perimeter you're on, and looking at what view the state has into your life as an individual. I think what to me was interesting about that, and about what Benjamin was talking about earlier, was that as an organism grows, as an entity grows, the ethics associated with what you choose to view or what you don't choose to view changes dramatically. If you think of the individual, we have a very defined set of ethics. They might be skewed one way or the other, right? Same way that those folks that steal your data have a certain ethical flexibility. We tend to have strong ethics. They tend to be based on a democracy. They tend to be based on social norms. As you start looking at the ethics of organizations or of large entities, and the state in particular, what becomes ethical changes. And I think that leads to really interesting questions when you start looking at the body as a data set, and you look at addressing every molecule in the body, looking at large scale addressing schemes using IPv6. Where do you draw the line? What is it ethical to look at or not? Today you can encode, you can encode an entire library into a genetic strand. It's basically 4 entities as opposed to like ones and zeros, but it can be done today. What are the ethical boundaries associated with the state using you to store data, or viewing data that you've stored, right? So I don't know. I think it leads to a lot more questions that might not be answered today, but definitely food for thought.
Giorgia,
Yeah, I'd like to add a thing, and I don't know if I can maintain this kind of level of the conversation because I never studied philosophy, and also because in English it's difficult, but I always try to oversimplify the questions to modelize in a way to understand. And while you were talking about how to define a perimeter, in my mind is that if we really want to oversimplify it, a perimeter is an area which could be physical or abstract or not, which is defined by the same characteristics in a way. And so everything is about defining the parameters to describe this perimeter. And when you're talking about the fact that how can we decide if you are inside or outside, maybe that the key is that this kind of perimeter could also be defined by the time and not just by ontologies and topic and space. So sometimes we can be inside and sometimes we can be outside, and everything goes back to the idea of utilitarianism that also Benjamin described. So a perimeter could be given by time and by our evolving needs and desires in a way to be inside or outside. And this is interesting because everything is also coming back to the fact of the motivation for each agent to act in the system, and so the fact that maybe that everything is related to the benefit that we immediately find in this moment according to our needs to be inside or outside. I don't know if it's clear or if it makes any sense, but as I see it, this is interesting.
I think that to follow on that a little bit, if you think about social media, everybody has their own perimeter, right? It's what you're comfortable with. I mean, there are people who will give you guidance, never share anything on Facebook that you don't want your mom to see or whatever. It's just sort of an oversimplification, but, if you think about it, certain people will only put certain things on Facebook. Personally, I don't put very much that's about me personally on there. Every once in a while I'll say, one of my kids did something or other, but usually I'm reposting a funny link to something or, whatever, and it's useless garbage that's on Facebook. But there are other people on my friends list who, they have Twitter linked to Facebook, linked to LinkedIn, and so every single thing that I see, there's people who post every restaurant they go to and every thing that they're eating, and there's people who will check into Foursquare, and there's people who won't check into Foursquare, and there's people who will let people check them in, and there's people who won't let people check them in. So everybody has their own kind of level of comfort with that, and I think, like Giorgia was saying, it shifts over time. I mean, how many people do you know who have Twitter accounts now, but 2 years ago or 18 months ago said, if I ever get a Twitter account, kill me. Because they thought it was the dumbest thing in the world, and then now they've decided, well, maybe everybody does need to know, when I'm getting coffee and when I'm going to the restroom and whatever. So I think, at least at a personal level, there's a whole range of what the perimeter means. It means something different to every person.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's important to, I think I like your comment here. I think it's important to keep in mind that these, that these technologies are evolving very quickly, and that what they end up really being good for in the long run, or what their ultimate effects might be, could be very different than what they are now and what we assume them to be. I mean, for example, Twitter, I think that, for me, I think that in the long run, the real most important users for Twitter will probably not be humans. They'll be things, bridges that tweet, plants that tweet, anything that tweets. It has to do with essentially announcing the state, something that wants to announce its state condition to the network. And the things that we might want to have announced as state condition is very broad. But I wanted to speak to this. I'd really like your point about the interior here. Elizabeth Gross is a philosopher who writes about Darwin, and particularly about the models of sexual selection within Darwin. And of course, there's two modes of the natural selection, which is this kind of this sort of war of all against all competitive mechanism by which organisms evolve so that they can avoid being prey, or they can be better competitors. But sexual selection operates on a completely different kind of principle. There's no competitive logic for a peacock to invest that much energy into the development of a tail that operates in this sort of way. And every species has some sort of mechanism like this. And in her work on this, she talks about, the Deleuze, so this is as well. There's I'll tell a quick story. There's a bird in Australia who, he pulls leaves off of the trees, and he pulls all the leaves down, and he puts them on the ground. He turns, one by one, turns all the leaves over so that the light side of the leaves are facing up. And he spends like an hour putting this whole thing together. And all the girl birds are up in the leaves up here as well. And once he's prepared the leaves here, and they're all sort of where, he then steps on top of them and he does a little dance for this as well. And his feathers are, a nice dark color, so there's this contrast between him and the rest of this as well. So on the one hand, thing we keep in mind is that any technology that we develop, and I think these are part of our evolutionary process, even if something is developed more for a model of natural selection, the competitive securitization, it can equally be used for this other model. It can equally be used as a mechanism for bringing the world into a greater form of communication with itself, sexual selection. What she calls this process by which she calls this framing. Animals frame the world. They frame themselves in the world. I frame the world in a particular way. I frame myself in the world in a particular way. And this act of framing is a way in which we take the whole landscape of the world and we draw it up, and we say, for this moment, this is the inside and this is the outside. And by making this thing on the inside, but in a particular way, we present the world as an act of communication back out to itself, and it becomes part of the way in which the world in turn communicates with itself and reproduces itself. And this is a fundamental principle to how this all works. I would hope that, I think, the types of work that you do, I find just incredibly, deeply fascinating, and really, I think the type of stuff that you do is really, working on what are the most interesting, you call them life forms, but really the sort of interesting developments in this sort of link between, of this larger biotechnological arrangement, and the way in which, cities go to war with themselves, the way that things like Stuxnet and Stuxnet are deployed in these particular kinds of ways. But what's most fascinating about them is not that necessarily their military application. What's interesting about them is ways that we can sort of take one level up of abstraction and think about them as biotechnological mechanisms by which one part of the planet is communicating with another part of the planet and starting something and stopping something and organizing them in a particular sort of way, and begin to think of them as compositional tools, as things that could be employed for a completely different range of purposes that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to think about. And in that sense, it's not just about ethics. It's about composition. It's about aesthetics. It's about design. So what are they good for, and what could we do with them that works in this way? Okay,
I
so there's my
I can
thing.
see Mako wants,
Yeah.
wants to.
So-
Well, sure. I mean, I mean, I think that's a great point, and I think that it actually goes back to a series of the earlier points, questions about like what do you keep private, what people decide to use, because I think that I think that you're right that the users of Twitter, or even Facebook are very often not humans, or at least not just humans, but not in the sense that I think that it's because there's lots of bots tweeting at each other. There are some, but I mean, I think that certainly message passing applications are going to be very common. Whether or not they use Twitter is another question. But there's a sense in which I think that a lot of what sort of the promise of big data is about sort of these new, largely technological or sort of like half technological approaches to gaining understanding in ways that were not anticipated, right? That's why it's interesting and promising, right? But it's, I mean, and there's a sense in which the large majority of work in big data has been driven by advertising, and it's been driven by viewership. People are interested primarily not in who's contributing, which is the stuff that I study. They're actually, for the most part, like the state of the art is really done about like what people are looking at, what they're looking at in the context of Facebook and so on and so forth, right? And it's true, maybe you are very careful about what you decide to post, but people are, in general, less careful about what it is they choose to consume. And yet that is precisely the kind of information which is being mined most heavily. Now, mostly, I mean, depending on your perspective of your position on advertising, more or less benignly. But not, I mean, they're not out to help you, except to the degree to which you think you really need the product that they're going to convince you that you really need. So I think that that's, and you can certainly imagine less benign approaches and don't have to imagine them, you can see some examples of them. So I think that the sense in which a lot of the data which is being created is sort of within a perimeter in which people are sort of very careful about what they're producing. We have to think about the ways in which those data can be analyzed in ways that we haven't thought of, in ways that sort of through that analysis break that perimeter, I suppose, and in the sense that sort of the kinds of things that we aren't used to thinking about even being traces that we're leaving become things which can be used. I think that I used viewership as an important predictor of what I think is a good thing, people getting together and working on great collaborative projects, right? But not with good productive results. But it's also certainly usable for lots of, and primarily used for things, I think, that I'm certainly less excited about.
There's an issue of intentionality that comes up here. In the example that Bratton was giving and that Dean spends a lot of his time looking at, presumably the intentionality is outside the software system. It's in the intentionality of the humans who created the software system, but presumably also you detect patterns where the system starts behaving in a way on its own, which might be related to the original human intention, but is self-organizing and self-directing and evolving. Now, in Mako's, one of Mako's slides, you actually were talking about Scratch as a constructionist learning toolkit. And I focused in on that because I had looked at Scratch a few years ago and thought it was a really fascinating project, much like the operating system interface for the One Laptop per Child project. Right?
I was also involved a little bit in that.
So it totally makes sense there that you're looking at interface design as one of the things that catalyzes a certain kind of intentionality, which then ripples through the system at different registers to produce effects.
Absolutely. I think that so for me, I mean, when I worked in operating system, I was mostly doing interaction design. So I'm interested in understanding some of these dynamics in the context of these platforms as a way of understanding how designers can make particular changes. And it's interesting. You can think of every design change which is going on in a community in which context you're recording lots and lots of things as a sort of opportunity for a natural experiment, right? There are these little experiments which are happening all the time, most of which no one's ever looking at, but which through sort of big data approaches one can begin to sort of understand not just sort of things about the particular design, but broader questions about the social dynamics which are being reflected in those responses to those designs. And I think that from the perspective of some types of from a whole bunch of areas of design, it's a real opportunity and a way in which design and social science are sort of moving, and computer science and more technological sciences are all sort of moving together. And I think there's some real interesting and also in some cases very problematic sort of opportunities in that space. So.
I think I'll throw it out to the audience here. I imagine there must be a few questions and comments on this panel.
Looking at these micro communities in terms of big data examples where you might have noticed or forecast things like colony collapse or these things in these kind of micro in your own research, but from the perspective of looking at, into the future of what all of these enabling technologies may bring about.
I'll take a stab at that. I don't know if I'm going to answer it exactly the way you might expect. So I tend to focus on the negative every day. We do threat modeling. We look at bad things that can happen, and we try to predict bad things that can happen. We use a lot of analytics, and we improve on these techniques every day to do these analytics. One of the things that have come out of that I don't know, when you look at the data, it seems somewhat obvious. But when you think about it from a society perspective, it might not be that obvious. We look at Giorgia's research into social media, right? There was a lot of discussion about just exactly, people, tweeting your location, hey, I'm here, Foursquare this, or Facebook, or whatever it might be. I tend to err on the side of paranoia because I spend a lot of time in DC with a lot of paranoid people. So we tend to avoid that. And I think what we see are emerging, we see patterns emerging where, the technologies that we see being leveraged today start making use of this information. When you look at it from, my perspective, again, the negative one, it's very easy to pinpoint the location of an individual based on the online activity, based on traffic patterns, based on the weather, based on, climate change, you name it. All these elements can be brought together to predict where a person's location is going to be at any point in time. So when you start, taking what we do in a pseudo-virtual world, there's the monetization of what we do, so it becomes physical, and you apply it to, individual location, the importance of that individual to the criticality of an organization or of a country, or of our economy, the potential for harm then just goes through the roof. And I think the problem with, the reason this exists is because people don't understand the importance of the data that they put out there. Going back to the point around advertising, right? Advertisers love information from your phones. Apple quite happily takes information from your iPhone and sends it back to a supposedly anonymized location. Your phone has an accelerometer. You tilt it, it knows where you are, it knows, the altitude you're at, right? It's, geo-positioning. Advertisers love this information, so ultimately if you're driving down the road, an ad can pop up on one of those big digital signposts saying, hey, listen, you visited a website the other day and we saw you like these pair of shoes, there's a store down the road that just might be selling them. So, there's benefits to that. I personally don't want to be told that someone wants to sell me a pair of shoes when I'm driving down the street, but other folks might find that to be beneficial and make their lives easier, right? So technology is designed to make our lives easier. The moment it stops doing that, it's not a very good technology. And I think security tends to overpower productivity, and that's why people tend to shy away from security, because the moment it impacts productivity, people will find a way around it. And that's what we do as users. We find a way around technology. So being able to adjust that view and educate people to the dangers of what they do, I think will make a difference to how people perceive technology, to how those changes actually occur in the future. So I think the patterns, as people get educated and understand what's occurring, those types of patterns that we're seeing, where the virtual world starts melding into the physical world, where we see high value targets being tracked, through their phones and through other elements, we in theory should see a reduction in that.
I have like a response to that, and specific to your comments about the phone. The reality, for me, the issue comes down to control, because in most cases, when talking about security, the attempts are to basically take control. I think in security's name, a lot of steps have been taken, which are essentially taking control of devices away from people. The way in which mobile phones are secured, as opposed to like PCs that historically you could install no software on your phone. Now you can only install it through a store, in which case it can be deactivated. There's centralized control, and it's control outside of the individual. For the most part, people don't get to determine what operating system runs in their phone or what software they want to run, or certainly not when it comes to a disagreement with Apple or whoever it is that you sold your phone. But this is a critically important question for all the reasons that you've suggested. This device has 2 cameras, a microphone, accelerometers, my location information. I carry it everywhere I go, and it is produced by and controlled entirely by organizations which I don't trust at all. I don't think that's enormously sort of. I don't think that there's a lot of people who go, no, I'm a big fan of my phone company here. And I think that this is an important. I think that this is an important question. The question of who controls that technology is to determine how it works, right? And I think that it's one in which, largely through the rhetoric of security, we are on the losing end of. This phone is much less under your control, even if it is more secure in some senses than your laptop, generally speaking.
There's a kind of an image which is very powerfully displayed in Michael Winterbottom's film Code 46, which is a kind of a near future parallel science fiction tale about a world within which biosecurity is mandatory and necessary. And it's implied that it's necessary because people shouldn't be allowed to reproduce with people who they're too genetically close to in a world where many people are cloned. But really what it's doing is it's kind of establishing this idea of a horizon within which total transparency and surveillance is actually not just accepted, but you can imagine, in Code 46, you never hear of a disaster that took place per se. It's really kind of prophylactic. But you could easily imagine us in the next 2 decades hitting a moment where something does happen where we give up any last vestige of privacy in a very sane interest for survival. And I'm not thinking of, let's say, jousting between the left and the right over individual rights and Patriot Act kind of questions. I'm thinking of something more extreme than that. Imagine a real pandemic. And in that sense, there's a completely different constitution of the boundary of individual, the boundary of agency, the individual, collective agency, and the way that the technology would function. I was thinking of one thing that Dean was saying specifically about the way that you are tracking these systems as if they're ecologies, but you also used a term from the medical profession of the suspect zero, right? I mean, you were looking for the first patient in the infection in a completely virtual environment. And I think that it's not just convenient in a Hollywood way to say that the terminology works in the virtual world, in the software world, and in the, quote, physical world. It actually makes sense from a kind of a biopolitical point of view as well. So I feel like that's one of the things that we also don't grasp yet that's already overtaken us. We really don't grasp that we're right on the cusp of having already become part of each other in a very Cronenberg-esque way that we can't turn the clock back on. We really have become part of each other now because of the way that we move around the world so much, because of the way we exchange genetics with each other so much, the amplification and intensification of that just because of globalization. So I feel like that's one of the other attendant horizons that it sounds very science fiction, but I would insist that it's totally real and here right now. And that, to me, is one of the scariest and most fascinating horizons. And I think maybe that's one reason why Benjamin is fascinated with what you're doing, because I think we're both seeing that there's a really fast closing gap between the worlds of the kind of software development, the worlds of our individual, historically, biologically centered agencies, and the kinds of systemic evolutions that you're tracking.
Sure. Well, I don't think there's much I can add to that. I'll try. I really don't think I can. So, we see the, you mentioned supply chain attacks. We spoke a little earlier previously about it. So supply chain attacks are, to give you a brief overview, attacks on, manufacturing infrastructure, right? But not, trying to, well, I guess at some point, maybe, inhibit that production of whatever widget it is. But if you can, control or manipulate or, influence the production of that widget in some way, as that widget ends up in an organization, you now have the ability to manipulate the flow of data in that organization because you're sitting on the actual raw infrastructure that controls the ones and zeros going across the wire. So, looking at that evolution from, moving from virtual to physical infrastructures, the individuals involved, how they evolve, using these massively scalable, interconnected environments that have been created for different purposes, right? There's a lot of reuse and recreation of these locations. We're seeing really interesting things whereby folks that were, if you look at the attacks on Georgia, the cyber attacks on the state of Georgia, right? These would, there was a whole large amount of political unrest. I'm not going to go into the details, but basically, not only did entire communities or activist groups get involved, but the various governments actually literally co-opted or brought in the resources of those same guys that were stealing information from your computer, using their botnets to monetize access to your computer, to perform large-scale denial of service attacks on news agencies in Georgia, on political websites in Georgia. So you are seeing this really interesting evolution where there were these I guess siloed environments where it was, hey, our goal is really to make a lot of money. The other folks were like, our goal is to impact a state, or to destabilize the economy of a country, or impact the nuclear production, or the production of enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. He mentioned Stuxnet, and that's really what the goal of Stuxnet as a virus was, or as a piece of malware was. What's interesting to me, and what Benjamin was talking about, is that the reuse, and that's sort of again negative view of the world, I guess. But looking at the reuse of these networks at a very high level, very shallow level, it would be sort of your SETI project, right, where everyone downloads a piece of software voluntarily, and they use this to now, I guess, troll through, various sort of radio signals and that coming from outer space to determine if someone actually, is out there sending us a message. We're seeing that today. We're seeing, another example would be, to try to figure out the largest number of, the largest, decimal, point down for pi, right? Everyone's computers are trying to do this. So we're already in that environment. We're already in these massively connected environments where everyone's phones are doing the same thing. It's really easy to, to leverage this for both really interesting, like really positive things, which, I think is really where we should be focusing. But at the same time, you open yourself up, through making your life easier, you do open yourself up to, giving up a certain level of control. There was discussion about, by doing these things, you're handing off control to somebody else to control what's on your phone, what's not on your phone, right? If you analyze the Android marketplace, which we do some of that, the number of applications that are legitimate that send out personal information to servers around the world are astronomical. Are you aware of that? Do you have control over that? Do you even care, quite honestly, right? So I think a lot more questions come out of the discussion around that than really any real answers.
I think we have to wrap up, actually, because we're about to be overrun by another event that's coming in less than 10 minutes.
Well, no, not to worry. We're going to carry the party over to Vapiano's at 13th and at University and 13th. Giorgia says it's authentic Italian food, better than they have in Milan. So we hope you'll all join us there. We're going to be on the upstairs lobby. We're all friendly. Please come by, say hello, stop in for a drink.
Just a few blocks over that way.
Yeah, just this way. And
Yep.
Thank you. Just one more round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much.